Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Christmas Day, Wednesday, 25 December 2024. On Monday, 25 December 800 AD, 1224 years ago today, Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. What meaning, if any, does this event have for us today, more than a millennium later? The historian Friedrich Heer concluded his book Charlemagne and His World with the reflection that the empire of Charlemagne constituted the beginning of the Middle Ages. He wrote, quote, German historians of the 19th century like to call Charlemagne the father of Europe. It is not inappropriate. Charlemagne came to the throne among the ruins of Rome, in the lull before the last eddies of the Germanic migrations. His creation of an empire was the first event of the Middle Ages, unquote. This is a later periodization of the beginning of the Middle Ages than many historians would postulate. But the spirit of Heer's observation is that Charlemagne inaugurated a new stage in the history of Western civilization. On top of that, this new stage in the history of Western civilization made Europe central to that tradition, and therefore central to the unfolding historical process where it had been peripheral to classical antiquity when Europe was a colonial backwater and pretty much an afterthought. This, of course, is still relevant to us today because this is the foundation of the world that we now inhabit, which has been continuously in existence since that time. The whole historical process was, of course, much more than merely the coronation of Charlemagne, which was only one brief event in the Carolingian Empire, but it's a significant and symbolic event that we can use as a point of reference for all the other events connected to it. So what is the meaning, if any, of Charlemagne being crowned Holy Roman Empire on Christmas Day in 800 AD? And if we can find a meaning in a particular event like this, can we find a meaning in a cluster or a sequence of related events, like the sequence of events that brought Charlemagne to Rome on Christmas Day in the year 800, and the sequence of events that followed after his coronation? And if we can find meaning in a cluster of related events, can we find a meaning in the totality of related events that constitute the whole of history? In other words, does history have a meaning? Since I've been talking about philosophy of history for a year now, it seems appropriate to trot out one of the big questions in philosophy of history. And the meaning of history is the granddaddy of all big questions in the philosophy of history. Moreover, it's a paradigmatic question from speculative, or if you prefer, substantive, or if you prefer, material philosophy of history, as it has been variously called, which is to say, a philosophical inquiry into the actual historical process rather than a narrowly epistemological inquiry into how we obtained knowledge of the historical process. Questions like this don't get a lot of love these days, but in the spirit of fools rushing in where angels fear to tread, I'm going to stick my neck out on the problem of the meaning of history, if only tangentially and inconclusively. The way I've initially framed the problem of meaning mirrors Fernand Braudel's distinction among the history of the event, the conjuncture, and the longue durée. Charlemagne's coronation belongs to the history of the event, and we recall that Braudel wrote of the history of the event, quote, "Events are the ephemera of history. They pass across its stage like fireflies, hardly glimpsed before they settle back into the darkness and as often as not into oblivion," unquote. The coronation of Charlemagne, then, can be taken as a merely ephemeral event, soon to settle back into darkness and oblivion. Only it didn't. I said earlier that Charlemagne's coronation is symbolic, and because it was and is symbolic, it stood out against the background of ephemeral events and was seen in relation to a larger historical story. This symbolic event took pride of place within what we can call the Carolingian conjunction, and then in the long delay of European history. The sequence of events immediately connected with Charlemagne's coronation is what Braudel called a conjuncture. Braudel said that a conjuncture lasts about a generation, more or less, and Charlemagne's career as a leader of the Franks endured about a generation. We could even say that the Carolingian Empire only endured about a generation, so that the Carolingian Empire constituted an historical conjuncture, what I just called the Carolingian conjuncture. When it comes to the long delay, we run into some problems. I could, with some justification, say that the entirety of Western civilization since the Dark Ages, about 1,500 years or so of Western civilization, constitute the long delay of which Charlemagne's empire marks the beginning, as suggested in the quote from Friedrich here. I could also, and with perhaps as much justification, limit the scope of the relevant long delay to the Middle Ages only, or even limit the relevant scope to the early Middle Ages. The Dark Ages alone endured long enough to constitute a long delay within history. All of these are periods of hundreds of years, so each could itself count as a long delay, but all of them also fall far short of the totality of human history, and this interests me in a couple of ways. Firstly, it interests me in the way I discussed scales of historical time in my episode on Fernand Braudel, extending the levels of time from Braudel's 3 to the 6 levels of time discussed by Stephen J. Dick. While I found Braudel's tripartite distinction to be helpful, when we escalate the scale of time under consideration to the planetary or the cosmological scales of time, we should measure historical time in orders of magnitude. Secondly, it interests me in a way that has what I take to be important implications for philosophy of history. One of the formulations we find time and again in philosophy of history, and especially in any discussion of speculative philosophy of history, is an appeal to the totality of history. We can find an example of this in W.H. Walsh's classic work on the philosophy of history, where he characterized philosophy of history during the period from Herder to Hegel, such that, quote, its aim was to attain an understanding of the course of history as a whole, to show that, despite the many apparent anomalies and inconsequences it presented, history could be regarded as forming a unity embodying an overall plan, unquote. This presupposition of historical totality on the part both of those working on speculative philosophy of history and those criticizing speculative philosophy of history has been around for so long and been repeated so many times that it seems to me that it is long overdue to be called into question. And I'm going to return to this, but first let's get back to the events of Christmas Day 1,224 years ago. There is a description of the event by Heinrich von Fichtenau from his book, The Carolingian Empire, The Age of Charlemagne, which I also just quoted in my previous episode on Leopold von Ranke. And this is from Fichtenau. Quote, on Christmas Day of the year 800, the decisive act took place. In the Church of St. Peter in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown on the Frankish ruler's head, and Charles was proclaimed emperor. The Pope had recently been tortured and imprisoned by his enemies in his own capital. He had been obliged to defend himself against serious charges in a trial before Charles. The situation was hardly auspicious for an imperial coronation. Nevertheless, the coronation was a moment of historical significance. Those members of the Roman nobility who attended the ceremony may well have thought that the Franks were hardly mature enough to enter into the heritage of the populus Romanus. But for the Franks themselves, it meant the fulfillment of all the things that had been hinted at in the prologue of the Salian Law. They were the chosen people, founded by God and ordained to rule Europe. Unquote. The first thing we notice about this passage is that Fichte now attributes many meanings to the crowning of Charlemagne, and these meanings are historically conditioned in a profound way. For example, Fichte now uses the Latin phrase populus Romanus for the Roman people. I could say that this was a curious way for Fichte now to frame the crowning of a Frankish king, because what did the Frankish kings of Europe have to do with the Roman Empire? In my episode of Nikolai Danilevsky, I've noted that Danilevsky used the strange hyphenation hybrid of Romano-Germanic instead of referring to Western civilization, which we might have expected. But there is a precedent for Danilevsky's usage. Leopold von Ranke's first book was Histories of the Romanic and German Peoples from 1494 to 1514. And it's entirely possible that Danilevsky picked this up from Ranke. And long before Ranke, but also long after Charlemagne, the political project that Charlemagne started would be known as the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. Of course, the event at issue is Charlemagne being crowned Holy Roman Emperor, which has the twin meanings in this passage that I quoted from Fichte now, that Charlemagne is taking on the mantle of the Roman Empire, and he is doing so as the king of the Franks. And these meanings, in turn, have the additional meanings that the Franks were being brought into the fold of the populus Romanus, and that the Franks are now the leading people within this fold, on the cutting edge of history, taking up the torch put down centuries before by the last Western Roman Emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and carrying it forward into a new age. That's a lot of meanings already, and I'm just getting started. The primary meaning that Fichte now finds in the event, which he calls its historical significance, is its function as the fulfillment of the destiny of the Frankish people. But he also finds it meaningful that the Pope had suffered at the hands of his enemies prior to this, that some who attended the event thought that the Franks were not yet ready to assume the mantle of the rulership of Europe. Some, but not all, of these meanings were already present in the earlier accounts of Charlemagne's coronation. Einhard, who was a contemporary of Charlemagne, who wrote an account of Charlemagne's life, the Vita Caroli Magni, described the coronation thus, quote, "He therefore came to Rome to restore the condition of the church, which was terribly disturbed, and spent the whole of the winter there. It was then that he received the title of Emperor and Augustus, which he so disliked at first that he affirmed he would not have entered the church on that day, though it was the chief festival of the church, if he could have foreseen the design of the Pope. But when he had taken the title, he bore very quietly the hostility that it caused the indignation of the Roman emperors. He conquered their ill feeling by his magnanimity, in which doubtless he far outcelled them, and sent frequent embassies to them and called them his brothers," unquote. So in this passage, Einhard is talking about the Eastern Roman emperors who were still serving as they had continuously since the Roman Empire at this time, and would for hundreds more years to come. In fact, it was a woman was sitting on the phone, Empress on the throne, Empress Irene, I think it was, at the time that Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. In the generation after Charlemagne, Notker the Stammerer, believed to be the same individual as that referred to as the monk of St. Gall, also wrote an account that mentions the coronation. Quote, as Charles stayed in Rome for a few days, the bishop of the Apostolic See called together all who could come from the neighboring districts, and then, in their presence and in the presence of all the knights of the unconquered Charles, he declared him to be emperor and defender of the Roman Church. Now Charles had no guess of what was coming, and though he could not refuse what seemed to have been divinely preordained for him, nevertheless he received his new title with no show of thankfulness. For first, he thought the Greeks would be fired by greater envy than ever and would plan some harm against the kingdom of the Franks, or at least would take greater precautions against a possible sudden attack of Charles to subdue their kingdom and add it to his own empire. Unquote. So we see that Notker the Stammerer repeats Einhard's claim about Charlemagne's reluctance to be crowned emperor. But he places this reluctance in a wider context of both divine preordination and the human, all too human political context of the coronation. And in particular, the rivalry with the Eastern emperors. If the actual coronation was anything like the paintings we have of it, which all date from hundreds of years after the fact, there could have been nothing secretive or spontaneous about it. The paintings show elaborate ceremonial and regalia, which would have required considerable preparation and the cooperation of Charlemagne, who could not then have seriously maintained that he didn't know about Leo III's plan or his role in the plan. But it's not really too difficult to imagine ways that preparations might have been made on the QT, and it could have been sprung on Charlemagne unawares, or maybe it was downplayed before the fact and turned into something much more than Charlemagne expected when it did, in fact, happen. And I'd love to have been a fly on the wall and saw what happened, but of course, that is not allowed to us as historians, not possible for us as historians. Earlier, I asked whether, if we found an event meaningful, the sequence of events leading up to that event and the sequence of events following that event could also be found to be meaningful. We can find support for a wider meaning of the sequence of events implicated in Charlemagne's coronation. Fichtenau's account is predicated upon the coronation as the culmination of a sequence of events, giving to history both directionality derived from the kind of teleology that seems to be involved in a claim of destiny, and the coherence that follows from this clear directionality. Both Einhard's and Notker's accounts could be assimilated to either providential or political history, either or both of which place Charlemagne in the sequence of meaningful events which, taken together, constitute the meaning of the Carolingian conjuncture. Fichtenau goes beyond this and places the Carolingian conjuncture within the longue durée of medieval civilization. Could this have been foreseen at the time? Was the office of Holy Roman Emperor meaningful at the time when Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor? If we maintain that the crowning of Charlemagne created the office of Holy Roman Emperor, and in fact created the Holy Roman Empire, then the position didn't previously exist, so it couldn't have been meaningful. At least it couldn't have been meaningful prior to that moment. Obviously, though, the position was modeled both on the ancient Roman emperors and the then contemporaneous emperor of the Eastern Empire. When Romulus Augustulus was deposed by Odoacer in 476 AD, 324 years before Charlemagne's coronation, the regalia of the Western Emperor was sent to the remaining Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. So it could be argued that it was the Eastern Emperor who properly had the right to bestow this regalia to a new representative of the empire in the West, should that ever become necessary or desirable or possible. In this sense, you could see the Holy Roman Empire as a revival, which many people did, and that's one of the consistent themes in the interpretation of medieval history is the revival of the Western Roman Empire. But that is more or less fictional. And if we do see it as a revival, we would presumably see some kind of official recognition from Constantinople. But that's another question for another time. One of the reasons Leo III seemed to have been ready to crown Charlemagne was his interest in promoting Charlemagne as a nearby power to protect him. For Leo, needed protection from Constantinople. Previous popes had played the great game of their age by playing off the Frankish ruler against the imperial house in Constantinople, but Leo III hadn't been as skillful as this and found himself in a bad position. One of the many meanings of Charlemagne's coronation was the return of the Western Roman Empire and the revival of Roman empires, Roman institutions, as I was just mentioning a moment ago, that's the theme of a revival. The Pope could crown an emperor, but he couldn't wave a wand and resurrect defunct Roman institutions, except so far as the church itself was a Roman institution, and the recovery of the church from its dark age nadir was, in a sense, a recovery of Roman institutions. But that's not what was happening with the crowning of a Holy Roman Emperor. It's clear that there were many meanings of Charlemagne's coronation of Holy Roman Emperor, many meanings of the sequence of events of which Charlemagne's coronation is an integral part, and many meanings that can be imposed upon the whole totality of human history. Instead of asking the obvious question of which of these many meanings of any of them is the true meaning, let's take a little different approach. Is there any limit to the number of meanings that can be associated with an event, with a sequence of events, or with a totality of history? Can there be an infinitude of meanings of history? Even though many meanings of history have been suggested, these attributions of meanings are still in fact finite, though an idealized account might attribute an infinitude of meanings to a given event. We can also ask what the lower and upper bounds of meaning are for history. Presumably, the lower bound is zero if history is meaningless, and the upper bound is infinity. We can rule out the null scenario in which there is no meaning of history. We've already seen that there are many meanings of Charlemagne's coronation and of the larger historical wholes of which that coronation is a part. Likewise, we can rule out any arbitrarily low number of meanings of history, since I've already recited the great number of meanings that have been attached to the larger events going on around Charlemagne's coronation. This leaves us with some arbitrarily large numbers of historical meanings up to an infinitude of meanings. It's entirely possible that a given event might have an infinitude of meanings associated with it, intrinsically so, and not as a result of confusion, conflation, or ambiguity. It's this possibility that sets the possible upper bound of meaning at infinity. I could argue that an infinity of meanings is effectively no meaning at all. This kind of reasoning is quite common, but it's also fallacious. An infinitude of meanings could still be highly selective among the total possible meanings of history, in the same way that prime numbers are a subset of the natural numbers, and while highly selective among the natural numbers, is still an infinite set as numerous as the whole set of natural numbers. An infinite set of meanings that are integrally related to each other, and which also exclude another infinitude of possible meanings, could constitute a robust meaning for the totality of history. If it's possible for an individual event to take on multiple meanings up to an infinitude of meanings, then the totality of history taken as a whole, and therefore as a unity, could take on multiple meanings up to an infinitude of meanings. What about historical wholes that are more than a conjuncture, and maybe even more than a long delay, but less than the totality of human history? In a word, what about civilizations? Do the histories of civilizations have a meaning or meanings? What if one history, say the history of Egyptian civilization, or the history of Minoan civilization, has one meaning, and another history has another meaning. Why shouldn't there be different meanings for different histories? When historians speak of medieval Japan or medieval India, they're applying an historical category from Western history to a history that was, at that time, disjoint from Western history. We can take medieval as a term of periodization, it's true. And while it is this, it's also much more than this. There is a lot that's implied in the term. Because medieval has meanings that transcend mere periodization, to employ this periodization to a contemporaneous but disjoint civilization is to import an alien meaning and to interpret that civilization in the light of an alien meaning. Therefore, we ought to welcome a multiplicity of meanings as a way to understand distinct civilizations. And there's some resemblance to what I'm saying here to Spengler's account, which is often misrepresented by shallow treatments as though Spengler were straightforward, a cyclical historian. Spengler thought that each civilization was absolutely unique. They do repeat certain patterns, but each one is essentially incommensurable, like a Kuhnian paradigm. So the possibility of a multiplicity of distinct meanings for a multiplicity of distinct civilizations points to an important ellipsis in philosophy of history. The presupposition of totality in philosophy of history, illustrated by my earlier quote from Walsh, tends to blind us to more modest and limited historical wholes. Philosophies of history that explain the history of one civilization but not necessarily another, I call parochial philosophies of history, and I hope to talk more about them in the coming year. What I'm getting at is that the question of meaning in history, when taken in its absolute generality, is premature. We have a lot more work to do on understanding the meanings of histories of individual civilizations to the extent that they can be individuated. Toynbee, of course, said that the proper unit for the study of history is the civilization, since anything less comprehensive than a civilization would constitute an incoherent fragment of a whole. This implies that civilizations are isolatable wholes, and while this may have been true for some pristine civilizations that originated, developed, and then went extinct in isolation, by far the greater number of civilizations in history have interacted with adjacent civilizations to a greater or lesser extent. The more any one civilization interacted with any other civilization, the more difficult it is to tell the story of one civilization without discussing the adjacent civilization with which it interacted. In my episode on Eugene Bolton, who's famous for the Bolton thesis, which is the idea that American history is properly hemispherical history, I argued that the reasoning behind the Bolton thesis naturally expands the scope of history from national history to regional history to hemispherical history to planetary history. In a similar way, the consideration of the explanation meaning of the history of any one civilization may naturally expand in scope to other civilizations as well, but we need to lay the foundations with a single civilization before we can escalate to the totality of history. But we can go farther yet than this. What if Egyptian civilization, for example, has one meaning, and Minoan civilization has another meaning, but the two taken together have yet another meaning as part of the larger historical structure of ancient civilization? And suppose this larger historical structure of ancient civilization, with its meaning, in turn takes its place in a totality of human history, which then in turn has its own meaning that are distinct from the subordinate meanings of historical structures that are contained within that larger totality. This latter approach would allow us to square the question of the meaning of history with the apparent multiplicity of meanings we find, at least partially square it. The multiplicity of meanings that we find in history could be the meanings of different levels of history, with levels of history here meaning telescoping periodizations from the briefest, like the history of the event, to the longest, such as cosmological history. To confuse or to conflate these meanings would be the historical equivalent of what Gilbert Ryle called a category mistake. Add to this the multiple meanings that any single event may have, in the same way that a person may be seen from the front or the back or the side and appear different from every perspective. And the meanings that an event can have are like distinct perspectives on that event. These meanings that cluster around an event might be related to a central meaning, so that all other meanings relate to that central meaning, or these meanings may be related to each other but not related to a central meaning, so that the meaning of the event has a reticulate or net-like structure. So there may not only be an infinitude of meanings of history, but there may also be a multiplicity of structures by which these meanings hang together for historical wholes that take these meanings. So I hope I haven't shocked you too much with my heretical account of philosophy of history and what we could call the true meaning of Christmas for philosophy of history. So Merry Christmas and thanks for listening.